Well, hello, everyone. I'm Ian Agranat. I'm the founder and CEO of Wildlife Acoustics. We're hosting this together with our international distributors. Over the years, we've sold about 70,000 recording devices to over 100 countries worldwide, and many thanks to all of you, our customers, our distributors, and great researchers like our speakers today for that. And we're just hopeful that we've been able to provide the kinds of tools that you need as researchers, biologists, ecologists, to help better understand our world. And it means a lot to us seeing some of the great work that you are doing. So our speakers today with us live from Australia is Dr. Michael Towsey. Michael is a senior research fellow at the Charles Sturt University and Queensland University of Technology. Michael has developed techniques to visualize long recordings so that ecologists can see the sounds they have recorded. Today, Michael will be talking about ecoacoustics for ecosystem management. From Purdue University and the director of the Center for Global Soundscapes, Dr. Bryan Pijanowski is also joining us. Bryan conducts work on the use of sound and soundscapes to understand the dynamics of socio-ecological systems. Today, Bryan is presenting toward a framework for using acoustic indices in ecological assessments. And hailing from France and the French Institute of Research for Development, Dr. Amandine Gasc's research projects include the detection of an invasive ant species silencing the tropical forests of New Caledonia and the impact of 2020 worldwide lockdown on urban soundscapes through the Silent Cities Project. Today, Amandine's paper is Perspectives of Soundscape Analysis for Biological Conservation. So thank you. With no further ado then, our first speaker today is Dr. Michael Towsey.
As Ian mentioned, my name's Michael Towsey. My work over the last, research over the last decade or so has been the writing software for the analysis of acoustic recordings. And to give you some idea of the scale of the recordings we have to deal with, currently working for the Australian Acoustic Observatory, and they have 400 monitors across Australia continuously recording. So we're faced with the prospect of analysing literally years and years of continuous sound. The topics I want to talk about are initially just an introduction. Bryan and Amandine will also be doing some introductory material. But mostly I want to talk about the visualization of environmental sound and the classification of environmental sound. Most of you, I think, will be familiar with the spectrogram. So we put a recording device on a tree, we record a period of time, and then we produce spectrograms. So a spectrogram is an image of sound. The x-axis is time and the y-axis is frequency. And that's a typical example that you see there. And what a researcher will do is they will skip through spectrograms. They see something that looks like the call they're interested, they'll play it, and they identify it, in this case, as a Lurens rail call. The advantages of acoustic monitoring, I'm sure you're aware of them. You get spatial and temporal cover. A researcher can't stay out in the field 24/7, but a recording box can. Acoustic recordings are objective, so they reduce observer bias. You've got a permanent record, so you can come back later to recheck your memory, or you can have improved software to run the analysis again. And of course, there is minimal impact on the environment. An obvious disadvantage is that you can only pick up vocal species, but it turns out that vocal species tend to be important indicator species. So the technique is really useful. Over the last 2 decades, there has been a tremendous advance in technology, and we can now record continuously days, months, years of sound, even if you have your recorder connected to solar panels. And this sheer amount of audio has given actually rise to a new academic discipline, variously called ecoacoustics or soundscape ecology. And the difference between bioacoustics and ecoacoustics is not just one of scale. Of course, it's different questions that are now being asked. I like to think of the difference between bioacoustics and ecoacoustics as a little bit the difference between weather and climate. So with weather, you're concerned about what's happening right now and the minute by minute changes in precipitation, sunlight, and so on. But with climate, you're having an overall view of what happens through the air, what's the climatic zone. And it's quite a nice analogy for the difference between bioacoustics and ecoacoustics. And so we're dealing in ecoacoustics with soundscapes, and at that level we're interested in monitoring ecosystem processes. The advances that technology has given us, of course, have given rise to a new set of problems. Namely, we simply can't listen to all of the sound that we collect. And actually, it's difficult to visualize it. The spectrogram which I showed you before, you notice the timescale was about 30 seconds. Most you can fit on your screen, computer screen, would be 30 to 60 seconds of sound at that scale. To visualize an entire 24 hours of recording at that same scale, you would require a computer screen that's about 1.2 kilometers wide, or in US currency, we say a mile a day. So the words that come up when you start to deal with such large amounts of data, big data, data deluge, terabytes, petabytes. A few years ago, I didn't even know what a petabyte was, but you soon learn in this game. So we need data compression. You've probably picked up that I'm a computer science, so I'm talking now from a computing point of view. We need data compression. And a typical recording, 44,000 samples per second. One motivation for acoustic indices from a data point of view is that you get data compression. So if we can produce one acoustic index from a minute of recording, we've got a compression of 2.5 million times. And this is the way we begin to cope with such large amounts of recording. So what is an acoustic index? Well, from an ecological point of view, an acoustic index is a property of the acoustic environment, and hopefully we get useful ecological information from an index because it will correlate with some aspect of ecosystem function. From a data science point of view, an acoustic index, it's a statistic that summarizes some aspect of the distribution of acoustic energy or the rate of change of acoustic energy in a recording. And typically, acoustic indices are calculated over 1 minute of recording. That's rather arbitrary. It doesn't have to be 1 minute, but typically, certainly that's how we calculate them. And third, from a machine learning perspective, an acoustic index can be viewed just as an acoustic feature. So it's a feature we extract from a recording, which we can then use for classifying soundscapes or classifying frog, bird, and mammal calls. I want to make an important distinction between what I call spectral indices and summary indices. So a spectral index, you have one value for each frequency bin. So you've got a vector, and typically that will be 256 frequency bins in your spectrogram. So you have a vector of 256 indices. Or you can derive a single value from the entire minute of recording, and I call that a summary index. So obviously, a summary index is a more compressed representation of sound than a spectral index, but they're both useful. So to give you some idea of what we can do with a spectral index, I take a 4-hour recording, I split it up into 240 1-minute segments, and then I calculate a particular index, in this case ACI, that's the Acoustic Complexity Index, for each bin in each frequency bin. The formula's down there, but you don't need to worry about it. The Acoustic Complexity Index is due to Farina and colleagues from Italy. And if you put all of those spectral indices together, you can create a spectrogram, which you see on the right there. And you can see that what we've achieved with a 4-hour recording is we're able to visualize it as a spectrogram in quite a small space. That would have been impossible to do with just the standard scale spectrogram. That's finished my brief introduction. Bryan, I know, is going to talk more about other acoustic indices. I'll mention 3 of them later on. But I think, Mona, is it time now to have a question? My talk's in 3 parts. I've just finished the first part.
Yes, we actually have several questions.
Yeah.
The first one is a question that the person would like to ask all the panelists. Can each panelist address the pros, cons of long, continuous 1 hour, 24-hour recordings versus short, duty cycled 1 minute every 5 or 10 minutes for soundscape analysis and understanding patterns?
Well, it rather depends upon what capacity you have for analysis and for storage of recordings, how long you have to leave your recorder out in the field. If you have to leave your recorder out in the field for months and you can't get back to it, you can't do continuous recording unless you have a solar panel. So therefore you would cut down the amount of power usage over time by recording in, say, 1 minute every 5, 1 minute every 10. I would say that's the justification. But if you can record continuously, then I think it's a good idea, particularly if you are monitoring species whose calls only last for a few seconds. You might be unlucky and have it call when you're on the off cycle. Any other comment, Bryan, to Amandine?
Let me just say that that's the last part of my talk, actually, is how to think about the trade-offs between what I call synoptic spatial sampling and long-term sentinel sampling of the acoustic landscape, of the soundscape. So, you know, having continuous recordings in the snapshot is extremely important as you begin to make connections between the soundscape, its content, and the landscape. But the landscape is evolving over time, has seasonal patterns, has what I call rhythms of nature that need to be captured. And you need to kind of compare and contrast those two over long term to be able to look at the signals of things like climate change. So I argue that you need to do both and set it up in a way that is looking at spatial gradients across 2 different kinds, human disturbance gradients and ecological gradients. But I've got a framework for that in my talk.
Oh, so I'm French, so I'm going to go the opposite way. I never do continuous recording because the scientific questions I have to answer never require that type of protocol. So I think it's really a matter of what question you want to answer, and you need to of course, you're going to have like technical limitations, but I would say for me, I never needed to do the 24-hour recordings, even though it's very cool to look at it. I never needed it so far.
So the next part of this talk is, my talk is the visualization of environmental sound. I showed you before what we could do with a 4-hour recording. And I showed you on the left image here, the resulting spectrogram from the Acoustic Complexity Index. But in fact, there are other acoustic indices we can calculate. One of them is the entropy. H stands for entropy index, and that's due to Sir and colleagues in France. And another index we can calculate, CVR, that's just cover, the percent of the spectrogram cells where you've got your signal to noise ratio above a particular value. So we have 3 different indices there, calculated 1 minute resolution. And what I hope you can see is that actually each of these indices has provided a different view into the soundscape. And that's important. And when I realized it, I realized that we could, this opened up the possibility of false color imagery. So Here we have the same recording as before, but I've assigned one index to the red channel, one to the green, one to the blue. And then on the right-hand side there, you can see when we combine these, we have what I call a long duration false color spectrogram. And I think it looks a bit better in the next slide. So at the bottom image there is a 24-hour spectrogram. So remember previously I'd said we'd need a screen 1.2 kilometers wide if we were going to look at 24 hours of sound. If you try and cram 24 hours of sound, and I've done this in the top picture there into a software such as Audacity, you get this blur, because essentially what Audacity does is it averages over time. Whereas with the false color spectrogram, we're able to pick out a tremendous amount of detail, including, I don't know whether my mouse is visible to you, but here we have the morning chorus. This is midnight, by the way, down here. This is midday, that's the morning chorus. This is the evening chorus. We have insect tracks here and midnight on the right-hand side. And all of this activity you see in here are different kinds of birds making different kinds of calls. And depending on the call, we get different shapes and colors. So we've retained a lot of information, despite the fact that we've achieved a lot of compression. And as we would expect, different locations yield different soundscapes. So in the top image there, you have, again, a 24-hour spectrogram, midnight to midnight, middays in the middle, tropical forest from Papua New Guinea. The middle one is bushland from Brisbane, Australia, and the bottom one is the Sturt Desert. And the Papua New Guinea soundscape, as you can see, it's absolutely jam-packed. To give you some idea, that red through there, that's a tropical rain shower. All of these blue tracks here and here, this is insects, and we have a mixture of birds and insects. It's a cacophony of sound, as I'm sure you're aware. This is wintertime. All these recordings were taken on the same day in winter of 2015. Very cold in this bushland, so nothing much happening at night. Morning chorus here, birds through the day. And in the Sturt Desert, also very cold. This in the middle here, it blows a gale in the desert in the middle of the day, and that's what we're seeing there, a gale. So we know that, as we'd expect, we're getting quite different false color spectrograms for different locations. Someone asked about water. We can do this technique with freshwater recording. So this is 6 days of recording, 2 different spectrograms that you can see here. One using, so 3 different indices at the top, 3 different indices at in the second one. And you can see a very clear diurnal pattern. If we enlarge just 1 day of recording, again, midnight to midnight, you can see that we have a lot of fish activity chorusing. That's the green down the bottom. We have insects which start to make sounds at nighttime. And we've also gotten red there, sounds which appear to be due to subterranean water flow. So this is a pond which is linked to other ponds. This is in Australia. Most of the water is flowing underground, and that makes sounds as well. So this technique can be used for freshwater recordings. We can reduce our false color spectrograms to a ribbon and then place them one on top of another. So now we're looking at 1 month of continuous recording. Once again, the red spots here that you can see, that's rain showers. You can see the morning chorus very clearly. The structure of the morning chorus changes over time. We have a lot of bird song in the morning. It eases off in the afternoon. The blue that you see there is wind and so on. So in fact, we've strung a whole year of sound in this way. It goes from the top of the ceiling in the lab down to the lab floor. But this is a way of being able to, at a glance, see many weeks of sound. This is actually the result of a marine recording. So once again, we're using the ribbon technique. We produce these false color spectrograms, convert them to ribbons, pile the ribbons one on top of the other. We're looking at here at 44 days of marine recording. It's in the Atlantic Ocean, 15 kilometers off the coast of Georgia, the calving grounds of the North Atlantic right whale. Each of those red blotches is a passing ship. So it gives you immediately some idea of the noise pollution in this part of the world where young whales are growing up. The pale blue at the bottom is the chorusing of the black drumfish. When you listen to it, it sounds like an orchestra of kettle drums. And the green here is some kind of clicking sound which correlates with tidal currents. So we're not sure what that is, but at one glance, you've got here the soundscape of an ocean. So it's quite a useful technique to get a feeling for what's going on. So that's the end of this section of talk on the visualization of soundscapes. Mona, do you want to take questions again?
Yeah, sure. Since we also just wrapped up with a discussion of the soundscape of the ocean, one of the questions is very much along those lines in terms of there have been many papers applying existing acoustic indices to underwater soundscapes. But there are, again, fundamental differences between underwater and terrestrial soundscapes. And while you provided here an example applied to underwater, the question is, has there been any effort put into creating new acoustic indices specifically created for marine and underwater systems?
Well, personally, I can say no, I haven't. The various indices I've used, like there are three in this particular image here that we've used. I've tried lots of others. I find that these ones are quite useful for the purpose. My brain is actually trying to think of what kind of an index might be special for the marine situation. We do have to change the frequency bands that we're working with and timescale. There's obviously a bit of devil in the detail in producing these kind of spectrograms, and so we do have to work differently with marine recordings. So we are making adjustments in that respect. But if you're talking about an entirely different mathematical calculation of an index, then I haven't really given it any thought.
So I think there has been some work done. Jen Mixes-Olds at University of New Hampshire has done some work in this area. But let me just kind of answer it in a general sense. Number one, in both the terrestrial environment and any aquatic environment, you have to understand the acoustic theater. By that I mean that is where the sound is being propagated across. So it is indeed a much different environment, but of course, those of us that are in forested ecosystems versus grassland ecosystems have to consider what that acoustic theater is like. In addition, you have to also think about the drivers of sound production by animals. So in the marine environment, the lunar cycle is really an important part of those dynamics and how that is kind of driven. So you really have to start thinking very broadly. And that's what's really exciting about this field, because it is connected to so many different kinds of environmental conditions and drivers, and you have to understand those linkages.
We do have another question here. How do you deal with temporal autocorrelation in consecutive 1-minute recordings?
We just published a paper on that. Dante Francomano is first author. Ecological Indicators, I think, looking at temporal autocorrelation and 1-minute samples, and actually different kinds of. So we took full-length recordings from, I believe, 6 different environments. So you might want to take a look at that paper on how to test that. We're kind of building it off of what I know in terms of spatial autocorrelation, and there are issues. Yeah.
Michael, you'd like to continue, and then we can take some more questions at the end.
Okay. Well, the last part of my talk, I want to talk about the classification of environmental sound. 1 year of continuous recording, there are 525,000 minutes in a year. And if we calculate 12 summary indices, you remember summary index is just a single value that summarizes some aspect of the sound in a 1 minute recording. Then we end up with 525,000 vectors, each of 12 values. We can cluster those 525,000 vectors, and we use k-means clustering, into 60 clusters. Now, the reason we might want to do this is that it gives us more data reduction, in fact, of the order of 10 to the 7, 10 to the 9. It also opens up new imaging possibilities. And so what we did was we did this clustering with k-means clustering, 60 clusters, so that now these the sound for 1 year is now grouped into 60 clusters, and we listened to some samples of what was in each cluster, and you can actually label each cluster. A lot of the clusters will be just silence, some of them are rain, some of them are wind, birds and so on, insects, and some of them contain mixtures of content. And what this does now is that it allows us to give a single label to each minute of recording through the year. And if we represent each minute of recording as a single color pixel, we are able to construct an image of 1 year of recording. And that's what you can see here. So we're now at the large scale climate level of soundscape ecology. What you see is the change in day length in Australia. In the middle, at the December-January, day length is longest. You can see in the orange there, that's cicada chorus, which is very prominent in the morning and midday and in the evening. The yellow is insect chorusing. We have rain squalls through the year, and pale blue is wind, and so on. So at this level of abstraction, if you like, of a soundscape, we're able to compare years of sound from different locations. So this will be one of the things which we're going to do with the Australian Acoustic Observatory. The actual location location of this recording is in that woodland site that you see there. But finally, I think most people, or a lot of people, they do acoustic monitoring because they want to monitor individual species of interest. And we can use acoustic indices to monitor individual species. And I like to think of this as some kind of a bridge between bioacoustics and ecoacoustics. So for example, here is a false color spectrogram from evening to morning, so through the night. The dominant feature you see there is this pink line. That is a continuous insect chorus that's very loud. But what we're picking up is frog chorusing, and in fact, 3 different species of frog that we can see quite clearly in this spectrogram. And that's useful because it's quite difficult to write a recognizer for an individual frog call when in fact actually the frogs are chorusing extremely loudly. So we can pick up this kind of phenomenon very nicely in a false color spectrogram. Cane toad detection has been an important issue. It's a pest in Australia. People have written recognizers, including myself, for this. But actually, when a cane toad is calling, it really stands out very clearly in a false color spectrogram, as you can see in the red line that appears there. And it correlates nicely with a detector which I made, which also picked up the call, but it's a lot of effort to write recognizers for individual species, and in this particular instance, we can pick it up immediately in an image. You can actually pick up a lot of frog calls through this technique. We've been able to pick up microbats in terrestrial recordings, so you can see them here. This is the red marks that you see in the top frequency band. There are a couple of species of microbat in Australia which get down to the audible level, but we have actually also used this technique for picking up bats in the ultrasound range. And finally, we've used this technique for cryptic species. I've been working with Elizabeth Snydersick and in collaboration with a couple of various US agencies. Two birds in particular I'll mention here. One is the least bitten and the other is the black rail. Now, the thing about cryptic species, obviously, is that typically they're low in number and also they call infrequently. So in other words, there's a low detection probability. And the only way you're going to pick them up is that if you have to monitor at large temporal and spatial scale. In other words, you need multiple long duration acoustic recordings. And you end up with so much recording that actually even just visualization becomes difficult because there's just too much of it. So we need a machine learning method for the recognition. But what we're using is the acoustic indices as features. So there are two papers down the bottom there you see that published on this kind of approach. So how it works is that on the left there you see the call of a least bitten at second scale. That's what you would see in a standard spectrogram. But these birds, typically once they start calling, they will call for consecutive minutes, and they leave a trace in a false color spectrogram, which I've arrowed there. Then it's not very obvious, but to the trained eye, after you've been looking for it, it becomes very clear. But you can't, in this case, we had to process over 100 days of recording. You can't do this visually. So we extracted the acoustic indices for that frequency band, trained I think it was support vector machine or random forest, one of those, doesn't really matter which, for the classification task, using those features. And okay, so this is just one particular day. It shows you the false color spectrogram, 3 indices at the top, a different 3 at the bottom. These spectrograms show different details, but we trained the recognizer, and down the bottom there you'll see where in fact this least bitten was calling. And so the recognizer is picking out where this least bitten was calling when it's not so obvious actually in the spectrogram itself. So this is a very useful technique. We've applied it now to about 4 or 5 different bird species. It works particularly well for cryptic species that are calling in a low frequency band. So I've shown you in this talk a range of possibilities for visualization using acoustic indices and for classification and detection of bird calls using acoustic indices. Thanks very much. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you, Dr. Towsey. That was terrific. Judging from the chat, there were several comments along the way of like, this is amazing. And so I think that people out there are appreciating the information you shared. I thought the deal plot and the ribbon plots, the way you visualize them are intriguing and a great way to visualize the soundscape. So that's terrific.
One thing I could add, sorry, just because the question was asked about recording 1 minute every 5 or 10, you can use this technique and make it work with 1 minute in every 5, 1 minute in every 10. I had a slide for that effect, but I cut it out because time's short.
Well, there are definitely a lot of questions. Some of them related specifically to your talk, others just in general about soundscape ecology. One that is gearing towards the top is many papers are testing the effectiveness of acoustic indices in predicting biodiversity, for example, with birds and enarons, in order to compare the quality between habitats over time. How do you see the use of this direct correlation, and what can we infer about habitats based on the acoustic biodiversity of the vocalizations?
That's an ecological question. I think probably I would be wiser to leave it to the ecologist to answer a question like that. One thing I would say, however, is that in my opinion, it doesn't make a lot of sense to rely upon just one index to draw conclusions about, say, ecosystem health. There are a lot of different indices that ecologists have been using, and I think all of them have some use. And I like to think that in combination, actually, they're even more useful. So I'll leave you with that thought. But yeah, I think that's an ecological question. Ecologists have to answer it.
Well, Michael, I really liked your answer. So I mean, you're spot on. When it comes to just, the fact that there are a lot of indices out there, and you're going to use them in combination. So I was originally trained as a landscape ecologist, and in that field, there's tremendous numbers of indices of spatial pattern and edge and shape and that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, landscape ecologists said you can't use just one. You have to probably use a suite of them. But you also have to think about what do the indices really kind of tell you, maybe even broadly. To get to the ecological aspects of this, I firmly believe that good studies should probably go out and also measure some aspect of the ecosystem of the landscape. And so there's a variety of tools to do that. And as a landscape ecologist, I'm usually relying heavily on satellite UAV remote sensing of the landscape and also GIS to kind of somehow quantify what that is. That way you can make relationships between the management that you need to apply to that landscape and really what the impacts might be in your measures of the sound. So you have to make all of those connections. And so many of us oftentimes say there's a strong connection between the landscape and the soundscape. You can manage the landscape, but you can measure the soundscape to tell you what is going on in the landscape.
Perhaps I could just add something to that. Elizabeth Snydersick, whom I've published with, and her work is here. She's a great believer in that to combine acoustic methods with camera traps, so that whenever she puts out an acoustic recorder, there will be 12 camera traps also around the place. So you're pulling in multiple lines of evidence. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, and then integrate those with weather stations so that you can understand precipitation regimes, how that's changing the landscape and the vegetation patterns. So before you know it, you really do have a sensor array going that allows you to really look at multiple dimensions of that ecosystem, which is actually quite important.
Yeah, I think for the question of biodiversity evaluation, I agree with what has been said. First of all, biodiversity is a very large concept, so it's very hard. I mean, it's impossible to summarize it with just one value. So of course, first of all, we using sound just have access to only a part of biodiversity, and with one index or the other one, it can be sensitive to different type of group of taxonomy groups. So you have to keep that in mind. But you can use a single index to show, so for example, and I'm probably going to talk about it, show a specific aspect of the biodiversity, saying you compare two different places that one has been disturbed and another one has not been disturbed. In that case, you're not going to summarize or the number of species singing, but and characteristic of the place. And in that case, even a single index sometimes can do the work.
Yep, thank you, Michael. That was terrific. Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Bryan Pijanowski.
Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is for you. I really would like to thank Wildlife Acoustics for putting this together and organizing it. It's really a great thing that they're doing here to help bring the community together around a really important set of technologies that are really helping us advance our knowledge. So my name is Bryan Pijanowski. I'm a professor and director of the Center for Global Soundscapes at Purdue University. We're situated in a place that's called Discovery Park on campus at Purdue. Discovery Park is a place where there's innovative kinds of ideas being explored across multiple disciplines. And of course, as you all know, sound is just about in every department on a university campus. You can find it in psychology and engineering, all over liberal arts, biology, in the geological sciences as well. So it's a universal variable, allows us to understand dynamics of place, but it also connects people through our sensory systems to place and also back to nature. So I think it's really important for us to kind of consider all the different dimensions of a soundscape. So what I'm going to do is just going to give you 2 slides here, a little bit of background on the center, and then move on to some of my thoughts on acoustic indices and how we might want to use them. So in our center, we have 3 missions. The first one is what I would just, basically call our scientific mission, which is to use sound to measure biodiversity, climate change, and impacts of human activities on every major ecosystem of the world. So we really take the word global seriously. I am a biogeographer and landscape ecologist, so I'm interested in capturing baseline. What is baseline for every one of the major ecosystems around the world? I have a list of 31, both in terrestrial and marine systems. We've done 27, and we've got about 4 or 5 yet to go. So I'm really excited about this particular initiative just from the standpoint of trying to understand the Earth system. We also have kind of a technical or an engineering kind of focus too in part of our mission, and that is to advance acoustic tools for both research, education, and outreach. And I'm very interested in training the next generation of scholars in these areas. We have a lot of potential out there. Many of you are very good technically running R and Python and getting into data mining and big data tools. And these are the sorts of things that we need to do to advance our knowledge and to really address some of these grand challenges that we are seeking to kind of solve. And then we have a fairly large educational initiative in the center, like to inspire youth and the public to go out and listen, connect back to the natural world. We have several high-profile programs. Let me tell you, sound is just one of those emotional triggers for people. You can bring them into your conversation, into your thoughts about the environment, and it's not a smokestack kind of issue if you can inspire people to go out and listen and be in awe of our acoustic surroundings. And so we have a means to recruit people and think about how to direct the public's attention to some of the things that I think that many of us that are ecologists are interested in trying to solve. We have a variety of exhibits now out. We have a large one down at the Indiana State Museum. That's about 1,500 square feet. Many of my students are just volunteering their time to develop these. Folks are very interested in doing this. We have a lot of artists, and we have a sculpture on campus where it's a talking head, but it has all these recordings that we've made from around the world. We have just completed and released an IMAX movie. It's called Global Soundscapes, A Mission to Record the Earth. I'm the executive producer. I've worked very hard on trying to develop kind of an educational paradigm around how do we listen by focusing on sound production, the acoustic theater in terms of the propagation, transmission of sound, and then the way in which people use sound and even in expressive forms. Um, Many of you maybe have been involved and taken some of our workshops. So we've developed Sound Ecology R and some other tools, but we're interested in building kind of communities around the tools and around trying to solve problems. We've done about 14 workshops. Amandine and Michael have been participants in these as well. And then our global soundscape project, which is basically to kind of go out and capture sounds in every one of the major ecosystems. We do have a citizen science app that we encourage people to go out and record their own soundscapes on Earth Day. I just want to know, what does the soundscape sound like, but also, how does it make you feel? Does it make you feel happy? Does it make you feel angry? What kinds of sounds are you listening to? And then we have an online portal platform for kids. I tell you, they love these, what they call the little green magic boxes down here. This is a bunch of kids working with wildlife acoustic sensors. They're going out into the woods. Many of them are from the urban communities, so they're not really exposed much to nature. And they go out and they're handling technology, and they really do love it. So we're trying to get people to think more about how to do science outside. So let me switch to what I would consider to be maybe a definition of a soundscape. I've thought long and hard about this, and some of the papers that we've produced back in the 2011-ish time have been fairly well cited. But basically, what we're interested in is what I call the duality of the definition of soundscapes. And it's been a term that's been used a lot in the literature. It goes back to the 1960s. It comes mostly from the area of psychology and the arts. But those of us that have been working in this area and are ecologists have really realized that this is a really interesting paradigm to think about all sound of a place. As an ecologist, I like to follow the Odum's school of thought and to kind of think about ecosystems and three of its major parts. This includes the biological, mostly animals and the animal communication, the geophysical sound sources. This is the movement of fluids and solids, and then the technological and the anthropogenic sound sources. And all of these are kind of bundled together in the sense that they kind of reflect various ecosystem processes that are biological and abiological. There's another side of this, which I find to be just as interesting, and that is all sounds of an organism and how it perceives its surroundings through its sensory tissue or organ systems. This is the experiential dimension. It follows Endler and his classic work in ecology on sensory drive. This is really important because you have to also understand, how do animals perceive their environment through sound? We're one biological organism, but we don't hear the same way that all the other animals do. So what we have to do is put this into context. And when you're doing something like working in the area of conservation biology, you also have to think about and consider the ways in which those animals are perceiving their environment, the role that sound plays, but also the role that sound plays in all the other kinds of sensory data streams. So odor, for example, and sight. So many of these are used by biological organisms. So you have to put everything into context. So like I said, there's like both sides of this one coin. So when you consider the physical dimension of it, the holistic acoustic mixing is really a reflection of the processes that create distinct sounds. So the argument that I've been making, and many of us are making, is that a sound exists because something has moved. Something that has moved is a process, and that process is something that we need to understand. As R. Murray Schafer, one of the art musicians that actually coined the term, he noticed that and recognized that there's a fluidity of a soundscape. It's very different than than a landscape or something that's visual. You have to consider it in a different way. But my strong belief is that all soundscapes characterize a place over a defined time frame. And so there's this strong linkage between landscapes and soundscapes, and you need to understand those linkages. And in many cases, I call these the silent variables of the landscape, and of course the sonic variables, which are within the soundscapes. Every soundscape has, if you begin to look at it, Michael's beautiful eye candy presentation, his slides really did show and demonstrate that there are these what I call rhythms of nature, these temporal cycles that are regular, that tend to be very natural. And the idea here is, as an ecologist, I'm very interested in what those cycles are and how to characterize those. And so I'm interested in the notion of space and time. On the experiential dimension, and this is something that is maybe outside of many many folks that don't study things like psychology and even cultural anthropology, but there's been a lot of literature that has focused on what's referred to as the organism's sensory system or sensorium, the sensation to cognition, and how does an organism use those sounds and other kinds of sensory inputs to navigate around the environment and to survive. We do know from a lot of studies in both humans and in animal ecology that there's a great variety of variation that occurs within a species. And that variation is based upon age and gender and experience. And for humans, those sounds, the sounds that we hear, is through the lens of culture, the lens of context, place, and time. And there's some great literature on this, especially by Scott Feld. Soundscapes are often segmented into the information packets by organisms and thus not used holistically. So what you have to also understand is that animals are navigating and existing in the environment, but they're not using everything that is potentially in the soundscape. They might use certain kinds of clues to provide them with the information necessary for survival. And this work was done by a person called Gibson. Sensory ecology is actually the term that he's used. But it's very interesting to think about, what's happening on the reception side. So as a person that goes out and puts these recorders out on trees or hydrophones in water, I'm listening to the physical dimension, but I also need to understand how our organisms responding to these sounds. And then finally, acoustic communication and reception perception is extremely important, and it's kind of an exploding field right now. The sensory drive hypothesis by Endler back in the 1970s kind of made us think about how do organisms listen. And there's acoustic filters, for example, are now becoming commonly discovered in many birds. So you can imagine that, as you're thinking about kind of how to focus on an endangered species, such as a bird, there are some species that can only hear their conspecific calls in the complexity of all the sounds around us. So what I'm basically encouraging you to do here is to think about soundscapes, both from the standpoint of how you record, but also how the organisms that you're studying are responding to all the sounds that occur in a place. Okay. So I've got a few thoughts on acoustic indices. Some of these, I think, complement exactly what Dr. Towsey was saying. But I have some thoughts on maybe a classification system that might be a little helpful. But in general, what I'm going to suggest here is that the acoustic indices that have been developed should not be used as one or two. Maybe you can find one that really is focused on the specific cause and effect relationship that you're interested in. But if you want to understand ecosystem dynamics, you're oftentimes going to have to look at a broad suite of acoustic indices. So here's something that I've put together. It's going to be in a paper coming out next year. And it's just putting acoustic indices kind of in a continuum where we're looking at intensity measures, things like dB, RMS, but some of the soundscape indices that many of us have developed, these are just, in some cases, thumbnails. I mean, we're interested in plowing through maybe millions of recordings, and we have to get a sense of how do they vary across space, time, and disturbance regimes. So these provide us with some information, but they're sometimes not as heuristic or informative as the ones that bioacoustic uh, uh, experts have developed. There have been a host of other kinds of tools and measures of acoustic indices, or including things like acoustic features. So you can extract these out, looking, and much of this is coming from the artificial intelligence data mining community, where we're just looking at things in the data, and we're saying, well, how do they relate to one another? How do they compare and contrast across disturbance regimes? And so these acoustic features are kind of a little bit more detailed, because you can begin to infer from these acoustic features maybe what kind of sound production mechanism is involved, whether or not it is something like stridulation, or it's coming from vocal cords. Another kind of set of acoustic indices that we've developed are these sound type indices. And oftentimes these are when you put a microphone in an ecosystem and you have no idea what those sounds are, but you can begin to identify them and begin to quantify them. And some of our students have kind of come up with some very interesting names for them, because they kind of onomatopoeia, which is, basically these sound like the sound in the recording. But you can develop some richness measures on this, and I'm going to show you how we've done that here. And then finally, you can do call detection, but I'll just be honest, you're not going to be able to know what every single sound is, or for that matter, have a complete species catalog of any place, especially when you're in the tropics. When you're in the tropics, you have high species richness and you have low abundances. You have a lot of rarity. So what you want to do is start to develop keynote species. These are indicator vocal species that give you a sense of how do they respond, and if you know the biology, how do they respond, for example, to disturbance, to changes in the ecosystem. If you're in some places where you might be able to have a full catalog of birds, you might be able to do something like this. As you move from the intensity measures all the way down to call detection, you kind of have to have a different kind of skill set. So when you're in this very, very summary information, where you can get some basic measures of intensity or complexity, you can generally run through these and plow through them using some fairly simple tools. And you don't have to have people that have to sit around like you do down here, which is listen to recordings, label them, come up with some kind of inter-rater statistic to be able to determine how well you're actually listening, recording, and labeling. So there's a variety of things that are involved down here. Oftentimes you might have something that is high value in terms of wanting to do species management or landscape management that's costly. So you would need a fairly large staff compared to the group down here, with bioacoustics expertise and statistical expertise, and knowing what those sounds are all like. Let me just say that I think that these, the ease of calculation is generally very simple, fast, very little computer human interaction down here. The level of specificity and sound source that you get from what you're listening to is around here. I would call the Soundscape ecoacoustics paradigm to kind of span all of these. There are a lot of us that don't do a lot of call detection, but we find it to be fairly useful, especially if you want to look at impact on specific species. So this is kind of in the realm of the bioacoustics paradigm, and I would call this kind of like the noise paradigm from mostly the 1970s, where we're looking mostly at intensity. So that's my broad overview of these indices, and I would agree with Towsey that you would have to really use a host of these if you're doing an intensive study, and in many cases we're doing that in our center. Let me move to ADI and AEI. So this is in the Sound Ecology package. The, 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 the rationale here was well, number one, when we developed these, there was no such thing as acoustic indices. I think Jerome was starting to come out with his, and we were just very interested in, well, how can we run 4 million recordings through some kind of algorithm even on a supercomputer and begin to understand really what's in it without having to spend a lifetime listening to every recording. And so we developed just some very simple, I mean, these are almost like embarrassingly simple measures of what I call activity or occupancy of sound in each one of the frequency bands. And so as an ecologist, I know a couple of things that's really important to a full understanding of the frequency band breadth and the presence of these of sound in each one of these. Number one, within each ecosystem, there is a fairly well-known distribution of body sizes of animals. And those are oftentimes rather predictable. There's been a lot of work that's been done on this it goes back to the 1930s, actually. And so I'm interested, and I was interested in, well, in each of the ecosystems, we know that, well, first of all, frequency and body size are somewhat related. So the larger the animal, the lower the frequency. And so if we kind of start to match up frequency bands and breadth and how full these are, we can begin to look at things like, is that frequency band occupancy across the frequencies exactly what we'd expect from ecological principles based upon body size pyramids? The second thing we're interested in is whether or not there might be any gaps. So those gaps would provide us with information about maybe what could be potentially missing. So we developed both of these, ADI and AEI. Let me say there was a third one that we used, frequency band entropy, that appeared in the bioscience paper. There's a slight variation on ADI. But basically what it's doing here is it's taking some of the output from C waves and just ask the question on the basis of setting a noise floor, how much sound is occurring in each one of these frequency bands. And you can specify how many you want to look at and what their breadth is. And again, the idea here is to kind of look at the breadth and depth of the sounds that occur. And many of us are fairly familiar with the fact that a lot of the sounds, the technophony, the sounds being produced by our combustion engine all over the world is sitting down here mostly in band 1, maybe in band 2. So people like Stu Gage began to think about, well, let's look at frequency bands in the biologically active areas and compare it to the areas where there's mostly this anthrophony or technophony, whatever term you'd like to use. And there have been also other kinds of efforts, the bioacoustics index, for example, that just looks at the richness and activity that's occurring within that biologically active area. Okay, but as you move from a terrestrial environment into a marine environment, you're going to have to switch these out because there's a much different set of frequency bands occurring that kind of reflect the different animals and body sizes. So in the bioscience article, I was very interested in, and many of us were interested in, just kind of mapping these very simple acoustic indices, ADI and ACI, out over space and time. And this is the one that basically got me hooked. It was just like, I understand the really the importance of soundscapes in making an assessment of the health and quality of the ecosystem. And so let me walk you through this, because this here is the motivation factor for me describing this conceptual framework, which is going to be the third part of my talk here. I'll begin to answer questions after this second part here. So what we did is we just looked at the frequency band diversity. We described the techniques in the paper. If you want, I can answer them through email. But anyway, it's early in May in the mid latitudes here in the northern hemisphere. We have a lot of birds that begin. A lot of the neotropical migrants are moving through, and then a lot of the birds are, of course, staying and breeding. So in the springtime, what we have is mostly birds, and then eventually we have amphibians. We do have quite a few spring peepers, so there's some activity here from the amphibians. But eventually the insects can begin to emerge late in the summer. So we have the cicadas, for example, and some of the katydids that are very, very common. And so what we begin to see here is, if we just follow this green line here, in the old growth forest, which is about 30 kilometers west of the campus here, it's in the Rost Reserve, we see a peak somewhere around September in the richness of the biological community. But as we kind of move into other areas that have seen more disturbance, such as Martel, this is a secondary forest. It's one of our study sites, long-term study sites in our departmental forest center. And then we have the wildlife area, which is a wetland. And then this F&R farm here is a tree orchard. And then when we get down to this area, this is what I'm calling flatlining. There's very little biological or even sound activity at all in this soybean and corn field here. So the idea here is that as you move from the old growth, more undisturbed areas to more disturbed, we begin to see less and less sound. And so the differential here is going to be a measure of the soundscape's reflection of the changes in the landscape. And of course, if you plot out this on just an hourly basis, you get something that looks like this. And here is our old growth forest that's sitting just like this. And we get this peak, this dawn chorus that sits right here, and then a dusk chorus. And in all of that different kinds of landscapes, we see the same kind of pattern, which is the nocturnal community. No surprise here, 65 to 70% of all animals are more active at night than they are during the day. And so they have to use sound as a means to communicate, sound as a means to navigate. So sound is extremely important for these animals. And so we get to see this, but we see this kind of, again, this temporal cycle, what I call the rhythms of nature. It's trying to understand it. So basically what I'm trying to do here is understand space and time, and then what we call disturbance in each of the ecosystems around the world. I kind of mentioned one area which I find kind of really exciting. This is a work by a former student of mine, Ben Gottesman, and some others that are still in the lab right here. And of course, we can see Amandine's name listed on this one. But this is plopping a hydrophone in a tropical pond. This is at the La Salva Biological Station, and then recording those soundscapes over a long period of time. And of course, no one's ever done a biological survey, unfortunately, of that pond. And so we really don't know what's there, but we do know its life. I mean, that's the important part. And so what he had done is sat down and listened to a lot of recordings and developed this kind of soundscape, sound type topology on the basis of different kinds of spectral temporal measures, and then very creatively put together some nice labels for each one of these. And what he did is he began to plot these out using a ecological richness measure, which is basically how many sounds are on average exist in each time period. And we have 18 down here, so we have a possibility of 18. This is what's really startling from this. In the morning and in the evening, we have a flip. We don't have a chorus. It gets quiet. And then it becomes louder during the middle of the day. And so you kind of ask the question, what's going on here? I tell you, one of the things that really surprises me as I began to compare and contrast ecosystems around the world is that our marine and aquatic systems tend to be flipped. So the dawn chorus tends to be the most intense on the terrestrial system, and the dusk chorus tends to be more intense on the marine system. So that's really important. Why are the animals in the ocean doing something completely opposite in terms of the time cycle? All right, so let me kind of turn to kind of a mapping out of the acoustic indices. Um, that's right now in Kaleidoscope. I've been playing around with it a little bit. Wildlife Acoustics was very gracious in allowing me to kind of tinker with this. It's a really clean interface. So here are all of the indices from Jerome's group. Another one here from Stu Gage's group. Here, Elmo Farina's group, our group, the Hawaii group, and then of course Michael's group. And I mean, every one of these tells you something different, and I just have a gut to what they tell me. But NDSI is based upon an NDUVI metric used in remote sensing all the time. How much biological versus anthropogenic sounds do exist there? Spectral temporal measures. Ours are just looking at some very quick thumbnail measures of diversity across frequency bands, so long as you kind of extract out kind of a noise floor, somewhat sensitive to high pass band filter, but that's okay. But anyway, you click here, you have process the files, and it goes and batches up some. So what I was doing here, here's just the one recording. I don't know if anybody can hear this. This is what I woke up to in Brunei. And so what I did is I was there for 3 months. I think I collected about 20 terabytes of data. I had 7 studies ongoing. I've only published one, unfortunately. So I basically said, let's kind of give this thing a little spit, kicking the tires here a little bit. So I just had 18 files, and this is what it does. And then it kicks it out to a CSV file. And lo and behold, you double click on it, and then you have all of the things that I clicked on, right? So yeah, so I even put in a little file here just to kind of see whether or not it's going to catch it, and it did. So that's basically my view of acoustic indices, and I do have a framework coming up that it's only about 4 slides. Questions?
We do have many questions. The first is, how would you take a given ecological, biological question, and from that determine which index or indices would be the most informative for that question?
So if I were focusing on something like biological diversity, I'd want to pick some that we're looking at complex signals, right? So animals are communicating, and they're communicating information. So something along the lines. This is where Farina was going with ACI, is to use something like that. If you're interested in the broad spectrum of all sounds, then something along the lines of what we're trying to do with the frequency bands. But some of it is just detective work. Starting with something and then drilling down. And I'll just be honest. I think it would be not a good idea to kind of go through and plow through all these files, automate everything without listening to anything. You have to go through and have a sense of what's making those sounds and what those profiles kind of look like. So I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question. There really isn't a cookbook that I know of. What I'm about to get into is something that is a framework for maybe beginning to think about this in a long-term strategy, but I don't know if Michael or Amandine has a better answer.
Probably not better, but maybe you can try to complete. So yeah, first of all, you kind of need to know in what environment you are and what you're going to target. Because as you said, Bryan, ACI, and understand also what the indices are doing. ACI is going to look at the variation in frequencies over time. So a bird vocalization is going to be, the index is going to be sensitive to that. Other type of indices are not going to be on this variation in time. And so like something like crickets is going to be continuous over time, can be captured with other type of indices. So if you target a taxonomic group, then you're going to choose this one or the other one. But what we actually do usually is we run them all and then we test them and we look at, to answer our question, knowing what we target in the indices. These are the indices that are potentially useful because they respond to what we're looking at. And then by experience, I know that there are indices that I mostly use because they work in a lot of cases, and some that I actually don't really use very much. Maybe 90% of the time, they are not useful.
Yeah, well, let me just add another thing. I mean, I find that partnering with people that are just great ecologists to be essential. You know, so I just started some work in the mangroves of Bangladesh, and I just developed some really good friends and who are tree ecologists, and we're partnering together. I mean, I'm listening to sound. He's collecting what I call the silent variables, but we're trying to put that ecosystem together and try to understand how it's being stressed, mostly by changes in the hydrologic regime. And so we actually have hydrologists too. So that it truly is a multidisciplinary thing. You have to put yourself in that mix.
Totally agree. Next question has to do with what challenges you find in soundscape ecology, specifically in the terms of the use of the acoustic indices or acoustic metrics.
Some of the challenges it's just trying to keep track of all the new ones that are coming out. No, really, it's just kind of overwhelming, and I find that exciting. So, you know, there are new algorithms out there to kind of parse through rain, which I think is great. Wow, rain. I'm not very good at something like that. You know, I'm trained as an ornithologist. I'm not sure how to even start. And so it's, you know, some of it is just trying to keep up with the literature, which is just exploding. Many of you are just sitting on the tip of this iceberg going, wow. People are being innovative. They're being creative. They're taking this technology and stretching it, scaling it out to the point where you kind of go, okay, now I've really got big data, you know, like Michael was saying. So I think the challenges are just right now is just trying to keep up.
For me personally, two things: filtering the files, so removing the rainy and windy files. I still don't have a good systems, a good method, so I'm never sure. So I have to do it by here most of the time. I use meteorological data, but it's not great enough, so that's a big deal. And then another method which is complementary to acoustic indices is machine learning and what we call a central neural network like things. I'm not trained, so I partnership, but it's sometimes I really would like to understand more of this and have more control of this technology and methods.
Okay, we have time for one more question, then we really do have to move on. This was a popular question. I know that Michael had a slide on microbats, but the question is about why are soundscape studies using acoustic indices typically restricted to the audible spectrum? Are we overlooking an important aspect of the soundscape by ignoring the ultrasonic spectrum?
Yeah, well, let me say that it goes in both ways too. So there's, in the broadest sense of sound, you got barometric pressure, you got pressure waves, and so to what extent? I mean, there's potential for animals to be able to detect changes in those. So we can go from very, very low frequencies all the way up to the top. And you know, right now, I have a few studies. I call them broad spectrum studies, where I'm instrumenting. I got, you know, a bad acoustic sensors out, looking at the regular sensors, hydrophones in nearby water, and then trying to get earthquake stations and weather together. That is really, that's where I'd like to go, more in terms of analysis. And I know Amandine and I kind of kicked around some ideas on how to do that when she was at Purdue for a while. But I mean, you're absolutely right. That's a potential frontier for this, is to kind of really take this big perspective on how this ecosystem is functioning by this, what I call, universal variable, of sound.
Maybe a way to go forward to full spectrum is to have one device that can do everything, wildlife acoustics.
Yeah, and then send us the data wireless, and calculate the indices at, do edge computing to calculate the indices at the sensor.
Get that, boss?
I heard you.
So here's what I think this is what we're doing in the center, and it comes from my strict statistical experimental design background of thinking through how to parse through cause and effect relationships at landscape scales larger, but also understand ecosystems. And so here's a little diagram I have here, and I'm just going to walk you through it. But basically what I'm interested in every study I go to, every place, every ecosystem, I'm interested in a human disturbance gradient, okay? So in Mongolia, I'm interested in grazing intensity of livestock, logging that's occurring along the fringe in the paleotropics, urbanization, cropping patterns, whether or not they're mixed, whether or not they're homogeneous, burn levels. We've done a lot of work, for example, in Arizona, on to what extent are ecosystems recovering from wildfires. And so what we do here is we begin to look at this as a gradient. And 5 is generally gives you an idea of what the trends are across this gradient, and whether or not there might be thresholds or breakpoints or tipping points that you don't want to exceed in any kind of management of those systems. And so ideally what you'd like to do is put maybe 3, so you're going to have some replicates in each one of these intensity zones or gradient levels. How do you measure these? Well, burn levels, some of this is remote sensing. Those maps are very, very useful. Urbanization patterns and intensity. We can do a lot of characterizing the landscape and each one of these kinds of levels. And so what you're now doing is beginning to look at a gradient here. But you have to put this into context because every ecological system has its own little gradient as well. So you might have a moisture gradient or an elevation gradient, which is temperature or salinity. And so you might have something that is, a really, really strong green versus, kind of a light green here. So you have this gradient that you're also comparing the human disturbance gradient. So it gives you a sense of how to change the landscape that is being altered by humans, reflected in the soundscape. Now, just about every study that I go to, every ecosystem that I go to, I do this what I call synoptic passive acoustic recording. It's 20 minutes per hour. I really love Michael's capture every minute. My students aren't, well, they're not happy with me bringing back this amount of data. But anyway, this involves setting up 27 sensors across the landscape. Before I go to a place, I'm doing a lot of GIS analysis. I'm doing satellite remote sensing. After I go, I have these passive acoustic recorders, SM4s, that are just sent to 1 minute per hour. And these are what I call sentinels. They're just sitting there listening. And what I can do then is go back and then begin to look at some of the satellite remote sensing imagery from, say, MODIS or some of the space stations. Got some wonderful sensors right now looking at the stress of plant communities on the ground, and then begin to explore these rhythms of nature long term. Okay, so here's actually Amandine in our study in Arizona. We kind of have this Borg-ish kind of, I'm a Star Trek fan, hybrid sensor where we got one of these hobo units being attached to one of the SM2s here. I'm always trying to document as much as possible. I'm always taking these 360 cameras, and so it's part of their database. And then I'm gathering the silent data, and we like to use LiDAR a lot because it gives us a three-dimensional structure of the landscape. Right? So how could we use these? And this is my next couple of slides. I don't think it was going to take a long time, but anyway, it gives us an idea of maybe the next generation of measures and indices, because these are very higher level indices. So let's consider a place like the mid-latitudes where, as we saw from the bioscience article, that some kind of measure of biological diversity, however we want to measure it, is kind of not so strong, not so complex. Early in the spring and in the winter, eventually there's this inflection point. There's this onset. And people that have studied plant phenology know this well. This exists, this inflection point happens usually at some kind of temperature threshold. And then what happens is, over the course of time, and eventually in the late summer, we have this peak. And then we have a decline and it comes back here. So you can start to begin to think about, well, let's just kind of put as one measure the timing of onset, and then another measure of the timing of the peak, and then how tall that peak is, and then what the breadth of some kind of measure is, some kind of benchmark that you think is kind of realistic. And you can do the same thing for the other, what I call rhythm of nature, which is the hourly dynamics, that diurnal pattern that looks like this. So what do these things look like when we get to begin to think about these? And this is, it might be my last slide here, is how does the soundscape change, both with changes in the landscape, but also changes in climate. So many of us know, for example, that as we warm the climate a little bit, we're going to have an earlier onset of both the vegetation, but the potential earlier arrival and emergence of animals, the emergence of insects, birds. And so this climate impact could be something that is shifting the phonology forward. Now, as an ecologist, I'm a little bit concerned about that, because that's going to reshuffle the organisms that exist, and we're going to measure those, right? So what happens if the insects emerge ahead of some other biological event that's really important for, like, a vertebrate? So we begin to look at this across space and time. What happens during the summer? Summer's becoming more intense. They're maybe even drier. So there's this change or depression that's as a result of climate impacts. And this green line is the reference, and this is what I'm spending so much time running around the world trying to get reference, baseline, for all of our ecosystems to do this. And then the habitat alteration impacts. So this begins to allow me to build this disturbance gradient and to be able to measure how habitat alterations impact this with regard to maybe changes in climate. So we can use every one of these measures here, 1 through, what do I got here, 14, as measures in the intensity of these across the landscape, across large regions, but also as a measure of something like disturbance vectors and like that. So that's where I think we could go with these. And many of the visualizations that Michael had really complement this, because you can visualize this also. But this kind of tells me a story about the two stressors on most of our ecosystems, which is habitat alteration and climate change. So my last slide here, I have to thank all the people that have worked so hard. They're very talented individuals and students. Some of them have moved off. Some of them are about to graduate, like this individual is here. We've been funded a lot by the National Science Foundation. Purdue University has actually helped us quite a bit. And then natural resource organizations from all over the world. But I tell you, if it weren't for these folks here, I really couldn't do my job. Okay. If you want to learn a little bit more about me, you can visit my TED Talk that I gave in Norway last year. And then, of course, you can shoot me an email anytime. I'll do my best to answer. Okay.
Thank you very much, Bryan. Applause, and again in the chat, a lot of positive comments. Very good. And so, moving ahead, Dr. Gasc.
So, hi everyone. I would like to thank you, Wildlife Acoustic, for inviting me to talk today, tonight for me. I really appreciated Bryan and Michael talks too. It was very, very nice and presented. So I'm in France right now. I've been recruited in 2017 in the Institute of Research for the Development. So it's a French institute. And I'm interested, of course, in soundscape analysis, and I work on questions about how to apply it to biological conservation in a really concrete way. So to help natural resource manager to use these methods. So how I said, I work for this institute, the IRD. So it's like an institute focusing on helping countries in developing science. So on different topics, and conservation biology is one of them. So I'm working here in the south of France, so close to Marseille, in the IMBE, so Mediterranean Institute of Biodiversity and Ecology. Some of my field work is in this Mediterranean landscape, but most of my field work is located in New Caledonia. So it's a Pacific archipelago, so tropical forest mainly. So I don't know if you all can see it on your phones and tablets, but here is like a summarize of how I see my work and how I see how the field could go and maybe should go. So on the left, you have the scientific actions that are, I divided them into 3 complementary axes. So the first one is working on improving the acoustic indices, and we could say the soundscape analysis methods in general. The second axis is use them correctly, so maybe working on the calibration aspect of these methods in the field. So working on calibration within different environmental conditions. We talked about how do we work in different habitats, how do we compare them. Those are questions that we do not have total answers yet, so we're still working on these questions. And of course, the final acts of scientific actions will be to apply all these tools, for example, to detect disturbances in an ecosystems, or maybe follow the restoration of an ecosystems that has been disturbed. So monitoring this restoration. On the right side, you have the people I work with, or I really want to help, the natural area managers, who have kind of 2 different actions, either the local actions, so they're looking at evaluating the biodiversity, detecting the disturbance, giving a value of the area that they are working in, evaluate, cannot see my slide, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, so giving an evaluation of the action conservation that they do, because when they apply for grants or for project money, a lot of time they ask, how are you going to evaluate the result of your action? Is what you're going to do or going to be working? Is it going to work? So how can you evaluate your work? And of course, they also need to be able to communicate their results by themselves without the scientific community. And we can also think like, how can they work together on a global action? So sharing their data, organizing synchronized action on a larger level, and develop a global proposal of actions that they actually share. In France, national parks are very interested in these tools. They really want to use them. I guess since the beginning, we were working on this soundscape analysis things. In 2010, they were already super interested. How do we use them? So we were really not ready to propose them any protocols. I think today we are, and we can work with them to develop like actual protocols that are actually can work for what they want to answer. So the field has improved a lot. And in between these 2 things, the scientific community as a natural area manager, of course, there is these visualization tools It's better if they're free and available, of course, but sometimes free and available is not super easy to use by a community who cannot code. So that's where Wildlife Acoustic maybe can help. Of course, online class and workshop to understand what all the indices are doing, what the tools are actually doing, how do you interpret the results that you're going to get, and propose standardized protocols. And again, open Soundscape libraries also help, and open source database, all this type of tools are very useful to communicate between the two. So I'm working mostly on the Swiss 3 aspects. So how do you use these tools to evaluate biodiversity, detect ecosystem disturbances, and monitor restoration processes? So I like to compare what we do in ecoacoustics with metagenomics, which is collecting a sample in the environment, extract DNA, amplify the DNA, and compare it to a gene bank to have an access to the composition of the community. And we do exactly the same in metaacoustics, or we can call it metaacoustics to do a comparison with metagenomic. We collect an environmental sample, which is a soundscape. We don't know exactly what is going on in it. Then we can extract acoustic element, isolate the acoustic element, and identify it with sound libraries, for example, to have a reference of this sound. That will be the detailed approach that can maybe lead you to a taxonomic group, or even better, to a species list. And what the acoustic indices are doing, they're doing just a shortcut from the collection to a value that can represent the diversity of the community in just one value, a global index. So I don't want to detail too much about what is Soundscape. I think Bryan and Michael really well described the background of Soundscape Ecology and what the indices are doing. This is one index that nobody uses except me, I think, but it's the number of peaks of a frequential spectrum. And I like to use it in presentation because it is easy to understand the calculation of it. So on the left, you have a sound of forest in New Caledonia during the night. I can play it. So there is a high acoustic activity, and on the spectrum, there is a lot of different peaks on the mean spectrum. And on the right, you have a low acoustic activity recording. So it was just a recording. It's not a disturbed area. It was just during the day. It was nothing was going on at that time. And so you see there is less peak. So it's like a simple way to look at the mean spectrum. Is it full? Is it not full? There is other indices that can give you this idea. This one has the advantage of not peaking when there is wind. Light wind, light background noise doesn't produce any peak. So that was the advantage of it. But of course, other indices are very good to reflect the acoustic complexity of a place. I wanted to show you an example of what we've done in the island of New Caledonia. So it's an hotspot of biodiversity, and there is a lot of what we call endemism, meaning the species are only found in New Caledonia. And we also have micro-endemism, meaning there is species you can find only on one mountain, so very localized. So we wanted to know if we could use Soundscape was reflecting this uniqueness of the animal communities there. So it was in 2010, and we were using SM1 and SM2. So the first version of the sound meter. We went to 3 different mountains, and we put one SM1 on each and 3 SM2 on each, and we just decided to use the SM2 for the publication. So we collected a lot of files, and then we listened to all of them to discard the windy and rainy files. So, and I'm still doing it today, so it didn't progress a lot. And so what we wanted to, and we did one index, which is called the DF, or dissimilarity of the spectrum. So we talked a lot about indices or that are calculated on one recording, but there is also indices that can compare two recordings. So it's an index of the differences between the recordings. And this is actually very consuming in time of calculation, but very useful in terms of information. For example, on the left, we were able to show that there is a temporal correlation, as we talked earlier, and this is actually the interesting part of the soundscape. So you have at the end of the arrow representing one recording, and we see that the recordings at 1 a.m. look similar, 2 a.m. look similar, 3 a.m. look similar, and they follow each other. One is closer to 2, to 3, etc. And the big pack of all the arrow on the, maybe you can see my arrows. Yeah, all of this pack is what happened during the day, and nothing really happened. It's like all the same type of recordings. So it was very interesting to see the succession in the acoustic activity over time during the nighttime. And on the right, we were able to show the uniqueness of these three mountains in terms of soundscape composition. So they don't look like they're very separate in terms of soundscape composition. So there is this acoustic signature of place and time. And the second example of something we did in New Caledonia is related to invasive species. So this little ant called the Vasmania oropunctata. It's very tiny, it doesn't produce sound, but it's very impacting on the local fauna. So we went to the south of the island. We went to 3 different habitats. It's in French, so it's forest, pre-forest, and shrubland. And we went to each time 4 different places without and with the ant. So 24 sites. We recorded 2 minutes every 30 minutes for 3 weeks. And then we listened and described orally only 6 days and 6 nights of the data set. So what we found is that, first of all, at nighttime, we described globally the type of source of sounds that we could hear. Cricket, bird, grasshopper, or others. And at nighttime, crickets are dominating completely the soundscape. There is a lot of species, a lot of endemisms. They're very abundant in the forest, but not only in the forest, actually, in every habitat we looked at. And they have a huge role in the ecosystem, either source of food, but also degrade the leaders. So it's very important for the ecosystem. So first, they dominate everything. And then we looked at only this community of crickets at nighttime. And we looked at the number of species that were calling, and also the number of calls in general. You have in white the non-invited places, and in gray the invited places. In every type of places, number of species or number of calls, it's dropping down. And we were interested in, okay, so we described the sounds, we demonstrated that there is a drop in this sound number of species calling and number of calls in general. Can we do it fast? Can we do it with acoustic indices? And yes, so especially in forest and pre-forest. In shrubland, with this index, it didn't really work, but that's why you need to test in different systems, like which index could work, what does that tell you about what is going on. And so on the right, you have only nighttime. In red, unfortunately, is the non-invited sites, and in blue are the invited sites. I should change the colors. And it's centered at midnight. And at midnight, so during the night, forest and pre-forest like have a high activity on the non-invited sites, and completely flat with uninvited sites. So yeah, this species is really silent in the forest. It's actually when you go and walk in the forest, people who are biologists, they know, like they know that something is different. There is a lot of less sound, and it's like a kind of a dead forest, even though it looks very nice. But the point was, can we think about a system that could early detect, for example, this invasive coming in? So there is all this reflection of, can we use that as an early detecting tool over disturbance to help the manager of the place? And sometimes it's very remote, like New Caledonia, the places that they have to monitor is huge. and so maybe something remote, they don't have to go every day to check, it could be very powerful for this type of places. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about a project called the Silent Cities that have been launched by Samuel Chalea, myself, Jérémy Froidevaux, and Nicolas Farrugia. So 4 people from France, and we were just during a meeting in France just one day after, or maybe a few days after, I think it was one day after the lockdown, so March 17 in France, due to COVID-19. And we were experiencing, like a lot of people, a completely change in the urban and peri-urban soundscapes. So it was very, we were witnessing a drastic change, and we were not allowed to do field work. And we had a lot of equipment at home. And so we were like, we have to do something about, we have to record to document what is going on. And we just sent the idea to the community. We have a lot of people around the world. So what we wanted to do is a scientific protocol, simple to apply. So we decided to do 1 minute every 10 minutes. And we didn't want people to put themselves in danger. So we wanted to have them put the recorder on a balcony in their garden, something easy to manage for them. And the point, the goal was to during the containment phase, have it during the gradual return to normal phase, and having back to normal phase, which I don't think we will ever get for this project. I hope soon for our lives. But that was the point. So we are still, like now we are rethinking maybe to how to analyze this data set with what was going on during the 3 months. So it's about 3 months of data. So we had 300 participants all around the world. So we were super happy that the community came together for this project. Of course, Bryan and Michael were part of this project. Their lab was part of this project. And we had audio moth recorders, and of course, acoustic, wildlife acoustic SM4. So that was the 2 requirements, one or the other one. And we have other people who use, like journalists, for example, who wanted to participate too. So we allowed a light protocol, and they use their own equipment to do some recordings. On the 300 participants, we estimate 100 followed correctly the protocol, and we are now gathering the data together. It's a nightmare, honestly. But we hope to be able to process the first run of analysis on the old data set, on calculating some of the indices, and also Nicolas Farrugia is leading one analysis on using machine learning and detecting some acoustic sources throughout the dataset. And so we should try to publish the first paper presenting the project, the dataset, and the first results, hopefully end of the year, but we'll see. And I wanted for the last slide to show you, to introduce you to our best, how do I say this? Well, I'm just going to show you, it's easier. So someone who helped us a lot during the Silent Cities project. That's the cutest things. And now I'm going to stop, I think, the screen so I can hear you.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Okay.
That was terrific. And I was very pleased to hear that you have SM1s after they have to be more than 12 years old still.
Yep.
So that's terrific. Mona, do we have time for a few questions?
A couple of questions that are very similar that are showing up in the Q&A. It has to do with data information sharing. You know, there is a growing emphasis on data mining and sharing and collaboration across multiple data sets. And do any of the panelists have suggestions on best practices for standardizing acoustic data collection analysis, for allowing sharing and comparison on a global scale, as well as perhaps some of the challenges with sharing data sets when dealing with intellectual property in culturally diverse academics? Kind of a loaded question there for everybody.
Wow, I think we've all struggled with this. No, really. I mean, you listed all of the major obstacles So, just to kind of give you an example, there are just a lot of people that would like me to share the, like boatloads of data. It's like 20 terabytes. Like, okay, well, that would take me like a couple of weeks to do that and stop and get the data out and find a protocol that my university would feel comfortable with too. Let me also say that in the United States, there's an increased attention to intellectual property, and especially here at Purdue, where they're just basically saying, if it has value, I'm not sure you're going to give it away. You're going to have to ask us first because I work for that university. And so I'm finding that when I do share the data, I have to work with them and the attorneys just to make sure that they feel comfortable because I am their employee. It's actually not my data to share, which is kind of interesting. Let me also say that I started doing some of this work in the urban environment and began to feel very, very uncomfortable when I started looking and getting trained in IRB issues. I'm kind of an urban ecologist too, so I was very interested in what is the sound of our urban cities like, and so there's a host of issues because you just can't take data like that because there are privacy issues that you have to deal with. So it spans the gamut, really. Wouldn't it be great if we could all share the data and everybody would be okay with that and there's no technical obstacles to it, you know? I'd like to hear what Michael has to say. I know that he's done a lot of data sharing and building, infrastructure to do that. The other issue is there's no one that's going to pay me to do that too. So it's like, who do I put on that? And we're all soft-funded. It's just, ugh. I wish there were easy answers to those questions, but I'm glad somebody asked that.
I could make just one comment here that we've centralized the processing of a lot of our recordings in the lab in Brisbane, but these recordings are coming from all over Australia. It probably may not surprise you that the slow link in the whole system, because everything's automated, is that the SD cards get posted through the post. And that's the slow point. We don't have the intellectual property issues, at least I haven't come across them, because in Australia, the grants that we get are all require that our data goes into the public domain.
So for the Science City project, for example, that was the biggest project, and we were super lucky because Nicolas Farrugia knew the OSF project. It's an open source foundation, so it's based to do sharing project with everyone. So we jumped in it, and then the amount of data we put on it, after our project, they put a restriction of the number of data that was possibly shared on this platform. So it was possible for the project, but not anymore. So we're gonna have to find other source of data sharing, at least for a little bit, to share the data, even if it's like a project for a few months, to have the possibility of having a place to share the data for a limited period of time would be great.
Could I just add one more thing there? So the National Science Foundation, which funds most of my work, they have two messages which are that it doesn't even make sense when you kind of think about it, because it's like, well, you can either do one or the other, you can't do both. One is we want you to share as much data that you collect, all right, because actually the public is paying for it. On the other side of NSF, they say, well, scientists should start to think about commercialization, small businesses, how do we get innovations out of the university? They're saying all these great ideas that these smart professors have are just all dying in the laboratories. So they're trying to get faculty, and that's why I'm actually over in Discovery Park, to think innovatively outside of the scope of academia. So it's a really tough nut to crack, to know that you want to collect data to make the world better, but you got a lot of people that say, well, why don't we see what we can do about having some income streams here with this? So, very interesting question. I struggle with it a lot.
Well, I certainly want to thank all of our panelists for doing this today. I think any of our speakers want to say goodbye?
Yeah, goodbye. Thank you very much for everything.
Goodbye, and thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks again for doing this. I really enjoyed it.
Very good success. Thank you, everybody.